Sometimes, the game doesn't live up to the hype.
And this one was over before it started, folks.
But that doesn't mean there's nothing worth talking about.
They've still shot over 80% from the charity stripe.
One man embraces this moment.
You don't find this exciting? Do me a favor, check your pulse.
Armed with the freedom to analyze, critique, and talk about anything.
What is the best sports movie of all time? I've decided.
Providing you the insight of game day, even if your team isn't playing.
Just a bit outside.
This is the Blowout Podcast with your host, Ty Schwartzlow.
You tried the corner and missed.
Sometimes, the game doesn't live up to the hype.
And this one was over before it started, folks.
But that doesn't mean there's nothing worth talking about.
They've still shot over 80% from the charity stripe.
One man embraces this moment.
You don't find this exciting? Do me a favor, check your pulse.
Armed with the freedom to analyze, critique, and talk about anything.
What is the best sports movie of all time? I've decided.
Providing you the insight of game day, even if your team isn't playing.
Just a bit outside.
This is the Blowout Podcast with your host, Ty Schwartzlow.
You tried the corner and missed. Hello again, and thank you for joining me for this edition of the Blowout Podcast. I am your host and producer, Ty Schwartzlow. We're going to run the gamut of emotions today. I've got no guests, but a wide variety of topics. We'll start things off relating to Minnesota Timberwolves fans, and there's certainly some, like Justin Barrientos, who are dead set in believing that Kevin Love is going nowhere, and I think he's flat out wrong, and I will tell you why. And we've also got Yovani Gallardo. Obviously had some big news on the field. I have a couple of questions in terms of him off the field relating to his trade value and potential contract status after the season. So we'll talk some baseball as relates to that. Certainly some overjoyed Brewers fans after the walk-off win from the, you want to call him a slugging pitcher. I guess that's kind of what he is, Yovani Gallardo. And then we'll talk a little bit more about baseball in general, more of a wider spectrum conversation about the sport in general. And then we've also got one of the more passionate topics, certainly, with the NHL playoffs. We'll talk a little bit about that. And then also the NBA playoffs. The Miami Heat seem to be on their way to an NBA Finals appearance. And then we've got an absolute knockdown, drag-out fight, I guess you can call it, in the Western Conference with the Spurs and the Thunder. And I just think the rest of the playoffs are absolutely going to be must-see TV. And we'll finish things off on a lighter note. I honestly, I make a fool of myself. It's I don't want to give it away completely, but it's certainly a moment from the early days of the podcast that I don't think you'll want to miss. So without further ado, let's get things going with the opening say. And today's opening say is going to be about Kevin Love. And we've been through this situation in the NBA multiple times before. Certainly the first one that comes to mind is the LeBron James Cleveland situation culminating in the decision. And I certainly you can get caught up on a lot of things and get bogged down when you enter this topic in terms of trying to have a conversation. But I just want to start out, put it out there. You've got the decision. Then you've got Carmelo Anthony and his, change to the way that LeBron handled it. And he went to the Nuggets a year before he was due for free agency, I think even a couple years before, essentially saying, I'm not going to stay here. You don't want another situation like the decision. Shop me around and trade me. Get some value back. That way, at least, I guess, with the Denver fans now, how much of it he was putting into stock, or how much stock he was putting into the fans' feelings of Denver, I'm not going to make that argument. But nonetheless, he handled it different than LeBron. And then you have the Dwight Howard situation. I think the Magic really were the best franchise to make out of the whole Dwight Howard situation. No, they don't have any success since having lost him, but at the same time, they got quite a good deal. And honestly, in terms of the public perception, I think Dwight Howard came off a lot worse than any of the organizations in that situation. So you look at it, and I just think from a potential GM situation, I have talked about it before. If I could have any job in the world besides this one, it would probably be to own my own sports franchise. And as unrealistic as that may be, it's kind of painting how I'm looking at this issue with the Kevin Love situation. If I'm the owner or I'm the GM, you've seen this play out before. The agent's coming out, and to the Timberwolves fans who are hesitant to believe that he's going to leave and that his agent, it's all hearsay. Well, what is the motivation for him if he's really going to stay in Minnesota? What is the motivation to have him be shopped around? And I certainly just gotta believe that where there's smoke, there's fire, and that's just the sense that I get with Kevin Love. Now, the reason I'm coming out and talking about Kevin Love when the Timberwolves are in their offseason is because the NBA draft is coming up, and this is a phenomenal opportunity if you wanted to trade up into the top 3 picks. And I'm not just saying trade Kevin Love straight up for the number 1 pick, because I don't know necessarily whether the Cavaliers would do that, and I don't know necessarily whether 1 pick is fair value for a proven NBA big man that can do the things that Kevin Love can do. The other monkey wrench that gets thrown into it is Love wants to play for a winner. Now, if you're going to get a high draft pick, that's sort of a catch-22 in itself. And then you've also got the fact that Kevin Love, wherever he does go, in order to get the most value out of trading him away, you'd want him to sign an extension in that place so that team knows they're not just trading for a rental. So if you can find that perfect combination from a GM perspective, from an owner's perspective, I would much rather have the next 5 or 6 years knowing that I have 5 or 6 years of Andrew Wiggins, of Joel Embiid, of Jabari Parker. No, you having the conversation with Landon Evanson and Justin in the office, the sense is no, keep Love. He's a proven commodity, and I agree. But what are you going to win in the West? And Justin makes the argument, and I'd love to have him on to talk about this, and you better believe I will. And he always makes the argument, well, they were in the Western Conference. If they were in the East, they would have been in the playoffs. They're not in the East, and they're not moving to the East. They won. They had a great season. They won a ton of games. But that doesn't change the fact that they didn't make the playoffs. Kevin Love wants to make the playoffs. Public perception is it's all about the rings. And when you can't even make the playoffs, it's very, very tough to put yourself in the conversation to be, say, a top 5 player. And I think that's where Kevin Love's ceiling could be. You put him on a Chicago Bulls team that desperately needs scoring. Defensively, no, he's not the perfect fit. But I think with Noah, he could definitely do some damage. And going through the trade machines and things like that, I don't see an ideal team match trade, whatever it may be. But I think you run the risk of, if your plan is to move off of him and you are not certain that you are going to be able to re-sign him for more than this next year, you've got to be picking up that phone and you've got to be getting the max value, because at a point these teams are going to realize, just like in every other superstar situation, the Dwight Howard, the Carmelo Anthony, they're going to realize that you have to trade this guy. You're going to lose him, and you lose all leverage. So I just think that right now, before the draft, with the chance to hone in on one of these young players in a loaded draft, I realize that doesn't always translate into on-court success, but in a highly touted draft, I think you've got to take a chance. You've got the asset to move up, and I look at Cleveland. Look at Cleveland. They've won this. They'll be their 3rd number 1 pick, and they still have not recovered. Now, obviously, LeBron James and Kevin Love are a little bit different level of players, but I think you'll be looking at a very similar situation if you're in a situation where you don't have Kevin Love on the roster. You have nothing to show for it. The idea of Jabari Parker playing alongside Ricky Rubio that'd be a fun offense. I can tell you that much, but it probably not any better than the passing ability of Kevin Love and Ricky Rubio. But just something to think about. I'm certainly have been known to maybe overemphasize the transaction game, and that's just fine. But I certainly know that there's some Timberwolves fans who it is unfortunate for, to be a fan of a franchise and you have this star player. It's the same. It's not the same, but it's similar to the Brewers a few years ago and having to lose Prince Fielder. is it's just unfortunate when you have to lose the guy that truly is a homegrown talent you've seen really grow up and mature before your eyes, and then to have him leave throughout what could end up being his peak, it's a tough pill to swallow, and it's certainly a very, very big decision for all the front office in Minnesota, and I certainly, you got to have faith. That's the one thing that through it all, I think we can wrap up the topic, is that you got to have more belief in this front office than with the previous Kahn administration, and David Kahn. Not exactly a sterling track record now, was it? But with that, I think we can move on to a happier note, at least for the moment, and that's Yovani Gallardo with a walk-off, wall-slapping double in extra innings last night. It was just going to come on. The topic I did have for today's podcast was about his potential trade value, Gallardo's, that is. And with him being a free agent after the season, you got to wonder what type of contract is he looking at, and how much should the Brewers be willing to pay to keep him around long term. And with that in mind, I was thinking you got to trade him and get some prospects back. But if you really believe you're contenders this year, and I, by all means, by all beliefs and everything I've heard, think the Brewers do believe in hey, they're in first place in the division, so nobody's telling. I'm not telling them they're wrong. But if you believe you're contenders for this season, I think you got to hold on to Yovani. The pinch hitting value is an underrated aspect that Landon Evanson, even prior to last night's game, is always quick to remind me of. You've got an NL team. It could certainly come into play for trade value, but I think the Brewers are good. Good to have him coming off their bench, especially with it's not necessarily a lack of depth, but in terms of the position players, I think they don't necessarily have the young guy who's quote unquote ready to step into the bigs and fill in some time for potentially an injured Braun, Ramirez, whoever it may be. So you need the team to be healthy, and you certainly it certainly helps to have a Yovani Gallardo to send in there as a pinch hitter and truly have confidence that he's going to come through. And the other thing I did want to talk about, now that we've established I want to keep Yovani Gallardo at least for this year. However, I'm not too sold on the fact of signing him long term, and I think that using a pitcher's contract year and then not necessarily signing him long term, but getting that final year where they have all the motivation in the world to produce. We saw it with CC Sabathia. It worked before, and I got to be inclined to think it's going to work again, especially with the depth of this team. Yovani Gallardo doesn't need to be an ace of this staff. You've got Garza, who hopefully is turning it around to some extent. You've got experience in Loesch, and then I really believe Willie Peralta or Jimmy Nelson, one of those two, are really going to emerge as a solid, young, reliable starter. And then you're talking about a 4-deep rotation. That's a nightmare for teams. You talk about maybe a Verlander, Scherzer having that dominant 1-2 punch. Well, the Brewers don't necessarily have that, but when you can go 4 deep, that's going to be quite a challenge in a potential 7-game series, and you certainly don't want to sacrifice. You'd sacrifice a little long-term value in terms of Yovani for some of this season's success, and that's, I think, where I stand on this. Now, I'll probably change my mind 2, 3, 4, 5 more times before the trade deadline, but that's, I think, where I'm at with the emotion of last night. And the other thing I did want to talk about now is just the shift in baseball, and Ron Renneke and the Brewers are one of the most frequent teams to employ the shift, and it's led to or played a small role, at least sizable role, in their success on the field this year. And it seems to me like in the past decade we've really shifted from the home run ball, the Barry Bonds being the household name, to maybe Justin Verlander being the household name. Maybe my point being we don't necessarily need the home run hitters. With advanced metrics, stats, shifting, speed has really made an emergence back in the game. You talk about D. Brown, over 30 steals already in the season. I saw that, and it blew my mind. But it's become a real premium on guys who can cover ground on the defensive end out in the field. Carlos Gomez, D. Brown, even an Andrelton Simmons, who isn't necessarily known to do things with his bat. I read an article earlier this year stating, it was an advanced metrics-centric article, but stating that Andrelton Simmons could be an MVP candidate if he could just do three very subtle things just in terms of his batting numbers. But the point being that the defensive value of the Braves shortstop is, it's the most valuable player award, so it's second to none, according to that writer's opinion. And it's fun to see the run prevention really being coming to the forefront, whether it's a great defensive play, whether it's a dominant pitching. This is the best Brewers pitching staff I think I don't want to say in my lifetime, but it's certainly up there, right, with the CC Sheets, I guess half a year. But in terms of depth, it's pretty good. And then you talk about a start in Jimmy Nelson this past weekend. Certainly just a cup of coffee, but really, really encouraging for Brewers fans and baseball in general. I think the blueprint, if you're just looking at it from the Milwaukee perspective, is solid up the middle. You've got Jonathan Lucroy, the first backstop they've been able to really develop from their own system, and that I can remember in my lifetime once again, but I'm only 21 years old, so take that with a grain of salt. And then you've got Gene Segura, the Zach Greinke trade. That was absolutely huge. It was a glaring hole, had been for the past few years since the J.J. Hardy trade. And then you've got Carlos Gomez in center. With those three up the middle, and then not to forget about Scooter Gennett on the second base side, but just up the middle to have that sound defense, that really, really helps a pitching staff. And then when you have the arms like I talked about, you certainly got to believe that this success is sustainable, and that is why I don't think you trade Yovani Gallardo for long-term down-the-road value. Now, if you get a case where you feel like maybe you've got a little bit of pitching depth, you can flip Yovani for a bat if an injury comes into play, or maybe it is the right piece. Yeah, maybe. But my main point is always with any of these things, keep the phone open and see what's out there. After all, it is your job. So with that, we're going to move on to the NBA. But first, I do want to talk about the NHL playoffs, and we've got the Blackhawks in a shocking series. I talked about it with Scott Boras, and he is a more educated hockey fan than I am, it's safe to say, and he thought the Hawks were coming out of the West, but the LA Kings, led by Johnny Quick, just showing why these are the two premier powers in the West, from my understanding. And I've said it before, and I'll say it again. Relatively new to the sport of hockey, and certainly a new fan of the NHL, but you hear it all the time. It's the best tournament in sports, and it's absolutely true. The way that the sacrifice, whether physically, emotionally, mentally, it is truly the sacrifice of a football game in terms of the violence. And then you've also got the fact that they're playing 7-game series. You're going up against these guys night after night after night. And you're going after these guys for a 7-game series, and then at the end of it all, they shake hands, and the amount of class. It's certainly something that I really was missing out on for years, and certainly will not be going forward. But that is my NHL minute for right now. And let's move on to the NBA as Justin Barrientos gets back from lunch, as we're 15 minutes in. Would love to have Justin on, talk about the Timberwolves situation. He missed my take on Kevin Love and why I think you've got to be picking up that phone, and at least if you're going to get something done, I think before the draft is the time to do it. But in terms of NBA going-ons, if that's a word, on the court, let's talk about the Miami Heat and their accomplishments to three-peat, including 4 finals appearances, 3 victories potentially in the last 4. I think if they were able to accomplish that, though, it would be the greatest sports accomplishment for a team in my lifetime. And right now, I guess, if the Pats had gone undefeated, I think that would have certainly taken the cake. But as of right now, to do what the Heat have done under the microscope, they have done it under, and really just the way that they have. You talk about LeBron James. If he wants to be the greatest player of all time, I think the first prerequisite has got to be an embracing of that limelight, of that huge moment, that big stage. And certainly critics have questioned that. But I think that the accomplishments on the court speak for themselves. And the amount of scrutiny and media attention that this whole Heat, the big three, if you want to call them that, have gotten is certainly unlike anything I've ever seen in my lifetime. And I certainly don't think that makes him the best player of all time or anything like that. But at the same time, it does give him a chance to approach some rare territory. He's been the best player in the league. Now you've potentially got a situation to prove that once again against the Spurs dynasty or the reigning MVP in Kevin Durant. And how much that means to LeBron, the MVP thing, I don't know. I think it's an overblown media storyline. But at the same time, for those in the media, that's how it will be written, a bird magic type, especially if Durant, with the return of Ibaka, can get to the finals. But with that, I want to transition now into our final special segment of the show. It's a new edition. It's the Lou Brown Memorial Call to the Pen, and this is actually one of our earliest podcasts, and this is one that never made it to air. But you can hear a young podcast host try to reach out to a Twins legend who unfortunately has passed away, and Landon Evanson, his reaction is priceless in this. He is under the impression that I am being facetious and completely aware of the fact that this that this was a joke, but no, I did in fact truly reach out to this person and think that they were in fact still living. I still do occasionally get some ribbing about it, as it is a very, very well-known player. You'll find out who that is, but I'm not going to sit and ramble on anymore. Let's get to me making a fool of myself. That's going to do it for the end of this episode. Thank you for listening, and we will be with you later this week.
The king of Minnesota. He is the franchise, and he basically has said, you guys, that was a dirty thing to do. You know, you got a guy who wants to stay here, even though you're losing. And that to me is always, you know, instead of the stock answer or the shrug of the shoulder, like a guy like A-Rod, I'll take Kirby Puckett any day over a guy like Alex Rodriguez or Ryan Braun all day. And from a talent standpoint, they were better than he was. But I'll take Puckett all day.
You can't underestimate some of the intangible aspects, and I think you segued it perfectly to our Snowball's Chance in Hell no-shot guest of next week. It is Kirby Puckett. That's right. We're going to do our best to get Kirby Puckett on the podcast next week. No promises, as this is the first one. But Kirby, if you're listening, on behalf of Ty Schwartzlow and everybody here at HBC Sports, we'd love to talk to you, but we will be in contact, so you can expect that. For Landon Evanson, Landon, do you have any final thoughts?
Yeah, I got a final thought.
What's that?
That is, we just had our Harry Carey want to interview Albert Einstein moment. You know, apparently Albert Einstein died 27 years ago. We're going to try and get him anyway. Cubs win. I'll tell you what, Puck calls in, you let me know.
All right. I will do that. You will certainly be a part of that process.
Well, you're damn right I will be.